So we're going to begin now with a gentleman who you may have heard of before, hopefully you have. He's going to explain to you some very, very unusual information. Like most people in this community, he lives a double life. On the one hand, he has his ordinary existence as a software engineer. He works for the Open University on accessibility for people with special needs. But then he goes home and then he changes and transforms into a man who researches subjects such as 9/11, space, free energy, and unusual artifacts like skulls and other things. And he's going to talk to you all about that today. It is Andrew Johnson, ladies and gentlemen. Give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. I don't know if this is on. Is this on? This works now? Okay. All right, so we might have to fiddle around with the sound here. Thank you very much, Ben, for that nice introduction. Just to mention that it's a very minor thing, but I don't do the assessment work for the Open University anymore. That kind of finished abruptly at the beginning of this year, but I do still work as a tutor for the Open University, so I do actually still work for them part-time. And so that sort of keeps me in biscuits, as it were. But anyway, so I'm going to talk to you today about the Starchild skull, and I've got obviously this thing here, so let's see if this is going to work. Okay, and just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've got a slide about that in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you to Taj for organising this event. It's often very costly in time and money to put these events on, so I thank everyone for their support. And so we'll now go on and talk about the Starchild skull. Well, so how did I come to get involved in this? Well, I actually got to meet this chap, who I think quite a few people in the room will know, Lloyd Pye, or know of him. And I first met him in 2004. I emailed him, I think it was back in 2003, and he was one of the rare people that actually responded in a meaningful way to the messages that I sent him. And he told me that he was coming over to London. And so I ended up going to Belinda Mackenzie's house. Belinda Mackenzie's quite well known in alternative knowledge circles. I'll mention her again later. And I met with Lloyd, and what had happened was Lloyd had been going around the world doing presentations, but he'd been using 35mm slides, putting them in a magazine, click the switch and it goes round, 35mm projector and stuff, the old way, but he hadn't got onto using PowerPoint. So I had a transparency scanner, because I'm an IT guy, I'm a nerd geek IT guy, that's what I teach in the OU, or tutor on rather, I teach geekdom in the OU of various kinds. So I got involved with him because I scanned his 35mm slides onto PowerPoint, and that's how we met. Just again, get a little bit more about myself. Had a UFO sighting when I was about 10, 11 years old, back in Skipton. I'm from Yorkshire originally. And the old saying goes, you can always tell a Yorkshireman, but you can't tell him much. So there you go. And went to Lancaster University, did computer science and physics, got into teaching and education in the sort of early 90s, and ended up working for the OU. Did a lot of software development work for about 20 years, as Ben mentioned. I don't do much software now, I just do bits and pieces. And then I got involved with the Lloyd Pye after finding the Disclosure Project, Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project, back in 2003. So I've also got one of these replica skulls as well. Unfortunately, I forgot to bring it with me today, but it's not necessary to the presentation really, particularly. So, but you can get replicas if you know where to look. They are quite expensive, but they are available if you were interested in such a thing. But we're going to look at the Starchild skull in this presentation, and a quick glance, it's very similar to a human skull. You just at a very quick glance, you may not notice that much difference, but if you give it more than a passing glance, you'll see there's some very unusual things about it. It's got all 8 of the major human components evident: a frontal bone, 2 sphenoids, 2 temporals, and 2 parietals, and an occipital, which is this bone at the back of your skull. Each of the components is profoundly redesigned. It's a different shape, different surface area, this sort of thing. And it's astonishingly reconstituted into something uniformly half as thick as normal. So the bone is half as thick. We'll go into more details than all of this. So in this presentation, we're going to look at the history of the skull, where it was found, basic physical differences, X-ray analysis, dental analysis, skepticism and debunking attempts, which have taken a new and disturbing turn early this year, which I'm going to speak about. We're going to look at DNA analysis, and we're going to look at other skulls briefly, or one other skull I think we'll have time for, and then a summary and conclusions. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly, and I'm going to have to flick to Media Player to play a couple of the video clips, because I think I'd copied the file incorrectly onto my USB stick and so forth. So the skull is actually owned. I don't own the skull. I don't have it at home or anything. It's not in this country. It's owned by a couple called Ray and Melanie Young, who I'll talk about Melanie Young later. And they live in El Paso, Texas. They've lived there, I think, for at least 20 years. In 1998, 2 skulls were given to Ray and Melanie Young of El Paso, Texas. They were given to them by somebody who worked in the FBI, I found out more recently. And they were unusual, and they actually went to one family. Then that family didn't like having skulls in the house, so they gave them to Ray Young. And then Melanie was a neonatal nurse, and she realized that this was, an unusual skull. There was something very unusual about it, and so she eventually came into contact with Lloyd Pye. Now, Melanie Young got in touch with Lloyd Pye through MUFON, because they were both involved with MUFON. And to tell you where the skull was found, basically it was found about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, and I've put it on the map there, roughly the area where it's found, in about 1930, it was 1930 actually, in the Copper Canyon area, and that's just a sort of Google Maps log of that. An American teenage girl was on vacation with her family near Mexico's Copper Canyon region, I said, went exploring into an old disused mine, and there was like a cave and a mining area with caves, and she found this in a cave. She actually found 2 skeletons, a human-like skeleton lying on its back. Beside it was a grave-like mound of dirt with an arm and bone sticking out of the dirt, and the hand bones were wrapped around the upper arm bone of the skeleton lying on the surface. So using her hands, she dug the buried skeleton out of the shallow grave and collected the bones. So there were 2 skulls together, a human skull and a human skeleton, and this other unusual-looking skeleton. She never pinned, in other words, the person that found it, this young girl, she was in her 80s by the time this story came out. She never pinpointed the exact location. Lloyd Pye always said that if they were to work on it, they were fairly confident they could have found where the skull was. But the thing was that she gathered up all the bones and she put them in a basket, and then she hid them somewhere temporarily because she didn't want to take them back. She didn't want to take them back to the family because she knew she'd get into trouble, so she hid them. And then there was an enormous rainstorm that night, and most of the bones were washed away. And when she went back the next day, she just was able to recover the 2 skulls. A human skull, which you're going to see pictures of, and the so-called Starchild skull. So again, found in 1930, and then kept at this lady's house until near her death, and just before she died, she passed it on to another family, and they passed it to Ray and Melanie Young. So just here, these photos, I think, were taken in the early 90s, and we can see quite clearly there, we can begin to see some very strange anomalies, and we're going to focus on these in more detail through the course of the next hour or so. So again, looking at the front view, we've got the human skull on the left and the Starchild on the right. One of the key things that comes out, you can't really see it that so well on this picture, it's more evident when you see this with the real skull, it has no brow ridges. You have these little ridges at the top of your eyebrows here, and the Starchild doesn't have these. That's the first unusual thing that you see. And there's no dip from brow to nose where you have this little dip here. Starchild doesn't have that dip. And the slits where the optic nerve goes through here, I'll just use the mouse to point to that, they are also much lower. They're about half an inch lower down, from top to bottom of the skull. And you can look at the cheeks, for example, they're different. Some of the cheekbones snapped off in a way which is improbable in a human skull. And you can see this staining on the left-hand side here. You've got this sort of dark brown colour here. That is also consistent with the story that the skull was laying in the ground with that on the left hand, with its right cheek in the dirt. The staining is consistent with the story that we got, basically, from the way it was found. So again, you've got the human skull on the left and the Starchild on the right. And we've picked out a few things here. We've got this inion bone here, more or less in the center of the picture, where you've got this slight sort of, and you can feel this on your own skull as well. If you put your hand behind your head, you can feel this sort of bit of bone sticking out. It's not that prominent, but when you know what you're looking for, you can see that in the Starchild, it's flat. It doesn't have an inion. The pterygoid plate is a different shape. The ear holes here, you can see the ear hole there is the area where that is bigger on the human, smaller on the Starchild. This skull we know had a concussion, so that's the human skull got partly damaged, where you can see these little cracks. One of the other early things that was discovered when Lloyd took this round is he tells this story in his book. This is in a book which I'll probably mention later. And he tells this story where he went to see one doctor at a university, and he said, let's measure the cranial capacity. So he got some bird seed in a jug, some of this fine bird seed, and tipped it into the human skull and then tipped it out into a jug. And it was, I think, 1,100 cc's, 1,200 cc's for the human. And then they did the same exercise with the Starchild skull, 1,600 cc's. So the amount of brain that was in there in the cranial cavity was 30% bigger than a human. 25%. So it's a very, very big difference. And also, if you put your finger into the inside of the skull here, the surface in there is different to a human skull, and it's different such that if the whole skull was at that angle, it would fall out into the neck. So the brain that this thing had was different. The material that the brain was made up of was different. Another big difference, an obvious difference, is the depth of the eye sockets. So if you put your fingers into a human skull, it will actually go back about 2 inches. If you think of, when you see these things where an eyeball has been taken out of a skull, it's quite a big bulbous, thing. The Starchild couldn't have had an eyeball like that. The eyeball would not have fitted in because if it had a human-like eyeball, it would have really stuck out from the front of the face. There's no way it could fit a human eye into it. Again, here's another obvious difference. The occipital is stretched high and flattened in the Starchild, though not as flat as the cradle. It lacks an inion, which I've already said, which is the lump at the back of the human skull. The Starchild skull has uniform symmetrical crease, thus no upward pressure from the hydrocephaly. This is something we're going to come back to. The hydrocephaly, we're going to cover this later, which is this inflate skull condition where the skull inflates, you get water on the brain. This is not a hydrocephalic skull. And you can see that here essentially. We can see that the coronal sutures, all the sutures of both skulls are healthy. There's no premature fusing, so this is healthy bone. It's not a deformity. Stains on the SC preservation after this, in other words, shows you. Again, you can see the staining. Shows you that the story we got is probably true. And all of what you see on these pictures, for example, this crease, we've got this where if you take the Starchild skull and you put your finger run it over the back, it's like a depression, to exaggerate, it goes like that, which means that this area of bone hasn't been pushed out by the skull inflating due to hydrocephaly. So it's not the skull of a hydrocephalic. And again, you've got other obvious differences here. The front of the foramen magnum, as it's called, the neck hole, is completely different. In a human skull, it's normally fused by age 25. The absence in the Starchild indicates age less than 25 at death. There's a lot of conflicting information when you look at the physiology. But it could be that it snapped off at some point, and then you've got other differences in the so-called zygomatic arches. I've got another picture of that later on. And so we've got different surface area for the chewing muscles. Again, we've got that on another slide, so some of this information gets repeated. Yes, so some of this is shown on this slide. For example, in this picture here, we've got an area of neck muscles where the neck muscles attach to the human, and in the Starchild, the area where they attach. And you can see kind of where the bone gets flattened out, little indentations on the bone. You know, if you're an expert on skulls, you will, which I'm not, of course. My background's in software. It's not in, you know, physiology, human physiology, or anything like that. You will see that these muscles must have been a different shape and size to fit onto the Starchild skull. And the zygomatic arches, your cheekbones, you can see, very much reduced in size. You just have to look at where they would have been, and they were complete, about half the size of the human. And then if you look at where the centre of gravity would be, if you think of the skull being sort of relatively heavy, the balance points are different, again, on the Starchild. So the way that it's a neck attached to it, if it attached in the same way as a human neck did, it would probably have choked to death. So it can't have had the same attachment to the human as the human neck. It was different. And here again, we said this earlier on, the chewing muscles. If you look at the area on the bone, you can see on the skull the areas where these muscles would have attached. And the human has a much bigger surface area. You've got quite long, sinuous chewing muscles. The Starchild's chewing muscles were very much reduced. So that's, again, sort of basically that. Again, people ask, has it been x-rayed? What do the x-rays show? I hardly need to say anything about this slide. You can clearly see the anomalies here. Obviously the human on the left and the Starchild on the right. And but I will point out a few things in that the thing that was really a surprise was the Starchild skull has no frontal sinuses. No frontal sinuses. And when Lloyd discovered this with this X-ray years ago, he originally thought that was a home run, as it were, because no human is ever born without frontal sinuses. But that actually, you can get it. It's very rare, but you do get some humans that are born without frontal sinuses. But again, you can see what's going on with this area. No trace of frontal sinuses, not even the vestiges. Eye sockets, round shape, lower placement, an odd upsweep at the upper outside of the corners. So the way that this bone is structured there is completely different to the human. There's almost no comparison apart from a sort of very roughly circular shape. And again, with this picture, this is a side view. The thing that we can note here is that we've got a much expanded area of light coloration in the Starchild skull. We've got darker areas here around the edges, and here the area of darkness is much reduced. And this, this whole shape of this area again is totally different. And the other thing you can see is little impressions, these little lines going through. Those are actually imprints from the veins. So when the brain is pressed against the skull and the blood is going through the veins, that blood goes into the brain there, that leaves an impression on the bone as it forms from a young being, and you can see that. So again, that rules out hydrocephaly, because with hydrocephaly, that you don't get these same lines. They get smeared out, and you get a much more even surface there. So it's not hydrocephalic. And again, the eye sockets, the way that you can see them from this side, again, it's totally different. There's almost no comparison. And this was this area which is showing that the area for the brain, great expansion of brain in SC's parietal area, the bulge is clear. Okay, so what we're going on to now, again, going through all the different, what we're going to do now is the brain casts and these CAT scans. So what was done, I'm going to play a video clip now to explain this, but what was done is they made a replica of the skull, then they took that replica, they filled it up with some type of plastic resin or something, and then they broke the replica open, and this is showing you the surface of the a replica of the inside of the surface. So I'm going to try and get this to go now.
Hi, this is Lloyd Pye. I'm sitting here in London at the home of Belinda McKenzie. and I'm with my friend Andrew Johnson, who's filming me, and we're going to talk about the brain casts of the Starchild skull and a typical human brain. Nobody's done this up to this point, so we figured it was time to put it out there and let people see the differences. As you can see, a human brain, and this comes from the lining of the inside of the skull, so that's really all you're seeing is the surface of the brain. But as you see, it's very lumpy. Everybody knows that a human brain, and really all animal brains, have convolutions like this that fold into the surface and leave these lumps and bumps, and you know, it's just the way it is. But you also see very fine veins. When any creature's born, its bones, or the bones of a skull, are so soft that the brain itself presses in and the bone will take the shape of whatever's there. So you can get the fine degree of veins, all these bumps and lumps, and you know, just a typical brain. So let's start out with that, just the surface, and you see the difference of the Starchild, completely smooth. I mean, just absolutely smooth, except for the suture lines, which are very visible, and the veins. Again, the veins you can see trailing off here, but no convolutions. No convolutions. So radical difference in that one area. Now another area of a radical difference is the frontal lobes. Now as you look and see, the human has frontal lobes, and that gives us our brow ridges. This fills in our brow ridges, and we all have that. And we all have this, and this is a lot of personality. This is a lot of who we are, what we are. Not so much thinking is where we make our good decisions and our bad decisions, our irrational moves, and make us crazy, and you know, also allow us to do sometimes very good things. You notice the Starchild just does not have that. It just doesn't have frontal lobes at all. And it has no brow ridges, and that's one of the real distinctive differences about it. But you also see the extreme shallowness of the Starchild's eye socket compared to the human eye socket. Human goes that far down, Starchild goes that far down. Just a very, very radical, complete difference. It's just got a completely different kind of eyeball set. And one of the real interesting things about this fact was I was in Philadelphia early part of this year, and I was talking to a brain person and showing them this not long after they had been made, and they're just plastic injection molds. And she looked at this and she says, well, with eye sockets this shallow, the eye can't be an eye like we have. It can't be a ball that moves and looks through a kind of a tube, and we have peripheral vision. Everybody knows how our eyes move in these big, deep eye sockets. So as she was looking at it, she said, it has to be a kind of a flat eye. And I've been saying that for years whenever I lecture about it. So it has to be kind of a flat eye. And if it's a flat eye, in order to get 180 degrees of vision, and that's the purpose of vision when your eyes are in front of your head, you want to see at least 180 degrees around you. With us, we can move our eyes. We see through a tube, and then we have peripheral vision. With this, she said, if it's a flat eye stuck in the head and not moving, it has to be basically all pupil, all basically black, all pupil just sitting there taking in the whole field of vision at one time. But if it does that, that means it has to have a much bigger visual cortex in order to handle that much input all at once, all the time. So she flips it over. Let's look at the visual cortex. And she says, oh, wow, look at that. Look how expanded it is over compared to the human visual cortex. And the human visual cortex is this two knobby areas right here. And the Starchild is as much as twice, really, spread out over. Smaller knobs, but stretched, the area itself is stretched out over here. So, you know, this is what she said, and this is what we take her word on, that this is good, strong evidence that the Starchild had a very, very different visual system than we do. And I've been saying it for a long time, just based on the difference in the eye sockets and the way the optic foramens are set in, where the blood vessels and nerves come in and control the eyeball and feed the eyeball and all that. Completely different in the Starchild. So, all things considered, these are some interesting aspects to add to the great mystery between the Starchild and humans, and of course, what is the Starchild?
So that was Lloyd, who I should have said that he passed on in December 2013 after a brief period of being ill with cancer. Some people are very suspicious about that happening. Lloyd himself thought it was a result of something that happened to him with a tooth infection that the cancer had formed. But some people have suggested that because of the sort of areas he was getting into, it was that's why he was basically, he was targeted that way. And he was great, I mean, you can, people in the room probably already familiar with him, but you can still find many, you can find many lectures of his on YouTube and so forth, so you can view those at your leisure. So briefly looking at the teeth, the dental analysis, this was done over several years as well, because part of the Starchild's maxilla was recovered, which we understand was part of the skull originally, but when there was this rainstorm, I think it got partly broken off, but the girl was able to recover this, and the teeth have been tested, which we'll come to in a bit. But there's a smooth curve from the top middle to the left centre, which we're going to see more clearly on the next slide. The Starchild had a nose opening, if not a nose, similar to humans, but there was still a number of differences. There were a different arrangement of teeth also suggests that the larger tooth, the larger tooth that was taken out is gone. In other words, this one was taken for DNA test, that one there, and we're going to hear more about the DNA test in a little while. But the small one remains in situ and is seen in extreme close-up in the next slide. So that one we're going to see in close-up in the next slide. So what they did was, because teeth are a very good place to recover DNA, then that's what they did. So this is shown here. The interest in this particular slide is that you can see that they've got some wear on the teeth here. So this is where we got conflicting information about the dental analysis, because I think is it on the next slide? Maybe it's not that one, but on the next slide or the one after that, we saw what we thought was evidence that this was the skull of a child because of the teeth. But this particular part of the skull shows wear on the tooth, consistent with something that's at least 7 or 8 years old, if not older. This is heavy wear, it's got clear pitting, shearing of the enamel. This can appear in children's teeth under certain rigorous conditions, especially eating a diet heavy on grit from grinding grain on stones, likely in Mexico 900 years ago. That's one thing which I'll probably mention in another clip, or get mentioned in another clip. It's 900 years old. It's been carbon dated twice, plus or minus 40 years. So it's 900 years old. And what they did with the surviving maxilla piece is they just made a mirror image. So this is the piece, put into Photoshop or whatever, or some paint package, just in a mirror image. And this basically shows you this area, the roof of the mouth. So you're looking at you're looking at this part now here. That is very flat compared to humans. So that means they had a very small tongue, or no tongue at all. And going back to the thing with the sinuses, the thing I forgot to say on that slide, anyone know what human sinuses are, or the frontal sinuses are for? Anyone sort of know what their primary function is? It's like a resonating chamber to make your voice more full and, carry better when you're speaking. Your sinuses help to do that. Obviously, you've got your nose and things and the shape of your mouth and all of that. But the sinuses apparently play a part in that. So if this had no tongue, or a very small tongue, maybe it didn't use its tongue to speak. And if it had no sinuses, it didn't have a voice. So maybe it didn't communicate by voice. So what did it communicate by? And of course, many people have had experiences and written about that and how these beings, or beings like what the Starchild might have been like, communicate, of course, by telepathy. So yes, I was sort of going back and forwards between this slide because I couldn't remember where this was in the sequence. This is where we have X-rays of that maxilla. So that piece of bone there, has been, this half, has been X-rayed. And what you see when you X-ray it is you've actually got some teeth inside of it, inside of the bone. They're called unerupted teeth. So that's where some people who looked at this thought this was a child, because these are like milk teeth that haven't dropped down into the jaw, etc. So there was conflicting information. We still don't know how old the being was when it died. Okay. So we're now going to go on to the bone analysis, and we're going to look at some. This was done in 2004. In fact, when I met Lloyd, he was seeing a guy in London who was actually a pathologist, expert witness. He used to get involved in court cases where people have been injured or killed, and he would be an expert on the pathology. Forensic pathologist, I think was his correct title. And he actually had a lab, so he was able to take a piece of the bone, cut through it with a Dremel blade, and they noticed some very unusual things. The various holes here, and then you see these little, where the arrows are pointing, the fibres. So we're going to look at these close up. This is unknown in any type of mammalian bone on Earth. There is no bone that has fibres like this. These aren't veins, because obviously the veins, when you die, when you've been in the ground for 900 years, the veins will be, decomposed by bacteria and so forth, and they disappear. So these are not veins or arteries, or they're just fibres. I don't think they've ever been tested as to what they are, and it's clear that they're quite strong because they were able to resist the effects of a Dremel blade, which I think you might see on maybe not on the next slide. I can't remember if I've got another slide. But basically, yeah, fibres in the bone. Don't know what they're made of. They're not capillaries, they're not veins, nothing like that. So this is the result of doing the test here. So this shows you that this really has been tested. We've got the human bone this time, the human skull on the right-hand side rather than the left. And we can see that the Starchild's bone is only 3 millimeters thick, and the human bone is 9 millimeters thick. So that's an enormous difference, way outside any kind of deformity or anything like that. And again, the bone has been tested with a mass spectrometer. Samples taken, put into a machine which measures what elements and what the relative abundance of those elements in the sample is. And you've got carbon and oxygen at a sort of different level, but the most unusual one here is the aluminium. This is a little spike of aluminium. There is more aluminium. And what Lloyd said was that when you look at the comparable part of human anatomy, this is the bone in the Starchild skull is more like tooth enamel. It's more like the skull is made out of what would be our tooth enamel. It's much similar to that than human bone. So what's going on? So you're stacking up these differences, and here's another one. When they did the bone analysis as well, where we found the fibres, they also found this red residue in these little, what are called cancellous holes here. So what's this red residue? It's not, you might think it's dried, blood or something, or dried bone marrow. But again, that decomposes. That decomposes after a few years, or probably less, even a few months. So should be no trace of that. But this is still in the bone when they did this. And here's more of a close-up of it, the reddish residue. And this is, you can get the scale there because that's about 9-10 millimeters across, something like that. So that sample. So what is this residue? It's not seen in human bone. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play one other clip as well. We should have played it, just to kind of give a bit of a recap on certain things. So let me just go back to that. And I'm going to play you a clip from, because the Starchild skull was covered on a History Channel documentary, and you're going to hear Melanie Young here as well.
How did you come into possession of the skull?
Well, a friend who got it from a friend who was the original owner of it gave it to me due to my expertise in neonatal nursing and anatomy. When I saw it and told them that this is totally out of this world, they were like, take it, don't bring it back. If it were a hydrocephalic, this would be bulged out, okay? But only one side would be bulged out, or the back would be bulged. It wouldn't be symmetrical like that is.
So a hydrocephalic skull is asymmetrical.
It's asymmetrical.
And this skull is symmetrical.
It's completely symmetrical. If that were a hydrocephalic, the bones would not be connected. There would be no skull.
What other explanation do you have for this skull?
I don't have one. I can't find one.
People have been seeing aliens for thousands of years, but there's never been a single piece of hard evidence. Now, it's possible the Starchild skull is just that.
We are here today with Lloyd Pye, who has worked as a military intelligence specialist. He has more than 30 years studying cryptozoology. He's the primary expert on the Starchild skull, having researched it for more than a decade.
Why all this interest in it?
I believe that it stands a very good chance of being the smoking gun that everybody is looking for, the holy grail of the field of UFO alien research.
Could you walk us through the main differences between the Starchild skull and a normal human skull?
The eye sockets of a normal human are about 2 inches. Starchild's not even 1. There are no sinuses in here, no upper sinuses at all. And you turn them around, you notice that the chewing muscles that come up through here and spread out to attach your jaw and chew cover quite a wide area here. With the Starchild, it's much reduced, so we have a much smaller, much reduced lower face. And there are fibers woven through the matrix of the bone, which were found under a scanning electron microscope.
Does this skull have any fibers at all?
No skull of any kind of primate that we know of, or any really bone that we know of, has those kind of fibers. They seem to be unique to the Starchild. If you turn around and look on the inside and you feel in here, you feel that ridging of bone that will hold the cerebellum in place. With the Starchild, because it has such expanded brain pressing down that way, at such a steep angle, we should have a spreading of the foramen magnum, but we don't. So we have a very different kind of brain in this skull, whatever it is. Now, if you stick your finger in the foramen magnum hole to simulate a neck, right, you see how the human is there, so it would be like this, but the Starchild's actually balanced like this. So it's kind of like a misshapen golf ball on a tee. It's very different from the human neck in that it's half the size and it's centered up under the head.
When you see how the neck connects to the skull, that's a closure for me. It's not a deformity. It was built that way.
We've had the DNA of the human tested fully recovered, no problem, normal human being. But in 2003 we found that the DNA of the Starchild was very different. While we could recover its mitochondrial DNA, which comes from its mother, the nuclear DNA, which contains the DNA of its mother and its father, we could not recover that, which indicates that there's something very unusual, if not completely different, about the father.
To your knowledge, is there any reason why the nuclear DNA was not recoverable other than the fact that it's not a human father?
If the father had been human, all indications are it should have pulled up very easily with the primers that were used, but it didn't, so we can only conclude that there's something very unusual about the father.
I'm really excited to meet with David Aguilar because David Aguilar has written a number of books for National Geographic on what's going on out there in the solar system and what other life forms may look like.
We are talking to NASA, we're talking to the Origins of Life Initiative here at Harvard. We're actively searching for life in the universe.
This really elevates our investigation to have a Harvard scientist weigh in and talk to us about the real possibilities of alien life coming into contact with Earth.
What shapes, what forms, what evolutionary pattern they might take, boy, that's the big mystery today. But of course, things are going to evolve differently on another planet. And there's no reason that we would have humanoids. I mean, the chance of finding humanoids that look like us, like you see in Star Trek, are so unbelievably small. You're going to get intelligent creatures, but they may not look anything like we would even relate to an intelligence. There's no telling what could be possible, but since we don't have anything in our hands to look at and compare, I mean, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it.
David, you just said that there's no evidence of extraterrestrial life right now. We think we may have something here.
Wait a minute. Guys, what am I looking at?
This skull was found in a cave in northern Mexico. It was carbon dated to 900 years ago. Look at the eye sockets. Look at the shape of the head, and look at the neck.
I'm curious, any DNA samples from this?
The mitochondrial DNA is human. They did the nuclear DNA test and could not sequence the father's DNA from the nucleus of the cell.
Are you saying this was a cross with an alien or just a human with a terrible deformity?
That's one theory. It's a hybrid.
Prove it.
Okay. So just a couple of notes on that clip because it's a bit out of date. The DNA tests have been done again since 2003. That clip was filmed in 2009. But I'm going to come back to the chap at the end there who was holding the skull because he said something very revealing in terms of the way the academic community works. So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So, but he was starting to be skeptical, that guy, and of course the skeptics want to focus on just a few aspects of the skull to explain it away. And the main ones that come up are its cradle-boarded skull. It's the victim of hydrocephaly, which is this water on the brain, which is the condition where the spinal fluid gets trapped inside the skull and can't get out because of a fault with the way that that circulates in the body and causes the skull to inflate. So that's another one. We'll come on to that. And the other one that's come up in more recent years is this awful illness called progeria. And so the Starchild is said, if you go onto Wikipedia or whatever, or any of the debunking websites, you'll see that the explanation, just forget about it, it's one of these things, nothing to worry about. So this claim of cradle boarding, well, what's that all about? In the area of Mexico, these people lived off the land, so you would have to, if you had a child, you might have like a couple of days or a week or something where you were recovering from the childbirth, but after that, while the men were off out either gathering or hunting or whatever, the women would typically be working on the land, planting things, harvesting things, and so forth, digging, whatever. And in doing that, they would put the young child on a board, strap its head to the board, and then you'd get cradle boarding. And this is what happened to the human skull that was found. I've already seen the X-ray of it. This is in case you hadn't already worked it out. It's the same pictures I already saw. And you can see on here, you've got a flat line. This skull, this human skull, this is not the Starchild, was cradle-boarded. But if you look at the Starchild skull, you can see you've got curvature here. It's quite slight. It sort of looks straight. But you can see on this, way this is illuminated, you can see this is sticking out more. This is protruding from the back of the skull to some extent. That's not cradle-boarded. The Starchild was not cradle-boarded. So that claim is false. Similarly, if you had this, because I've mentioned about the balance points and the way the neck attached, if you had that on a cradle board here with the bottom right picture, it would have choked to death. So as soon as you put the Starchild on a cradle board, it would have choked to death. Is it hydrocephaly? This is what hydrocephalic skull looks like when not treated. This poor child has not had this treated. And the key thing is the bones split apart. And Melanie Young was asked about this in that clip. I'm going to play a part of that clip again later before we close. And what happens is these you saw the separate plates in the skull in the earlier pictures where you've got these dividing lines. These in a hydrocephalic split apart. So when the being dies, the skull just falls apart because the bones are not properly bonded together. You've only got soft tissue, binding the skull together. And so that's why here this soft tissue will then, decay at death and the skull will fall apart. So you won't have a complete skull. So it can't be hydrocephalic as the skull wouldn't be complete. And you've also got this crease that I mentioned before, which shows you that the skull wasn't being inflated. You know, you get an almost spherical appearance here with this, again, with this poor child. And this is what this hydrocephalic skull looks like after death. It's just different. You know, you can see here that actually there's a little thing at the top. It's not fused. The bones are not fused. So you get holes in the skull. These bones are fused. This was not hydrocephaly. They're fused together with the hydrocephalic. You'd see these bones, there'd be gaps here where there was this soft tissue there. And the vein lines, again, I'd shown you that before. These veins can be seen, which means it's not hydrocephalic vein tracts. Is it progeria? That's the other one. Progeria is this condition which causes premature aging. You know, when you get to about 3 years old, your body is like the body of like a 60-year-old or something. And you get various problems, swollen veins, absence of eyebrows, eyelashes, beak-shaped nose, shrunken chin, premature cardiac disease, narrow chest, swollen and stiff joints and age spots on the skin. This is a progeria victim on the left and a mock-up. People ask about facial reconstructions. Yes, these are done. We've probably got another one coming up shortly. The shape of the skull, I think we've got another slide here. It doesn't fit. You can see that you've got a much higher dome in proportion to the size of the skull with a progeria victim, and other features don't fit. It's not progeria. It's not progeria. And also they claim, for example, that the Starchild's bone, is it progeria? They claim that the bone would be weak. The Starchild's bone is extremely strong. In fact, they couldn't cut it with the normal procedures for cutting human bone. It's much, much harder. And that's not the case with progeria. So the hardness of the bone alone, as well as all these other things, rules out progeria. And you get that sort of effect as well, which I've already said. That's obviously a mock-up on the left. But the bones don't fuse properly because they don't grow properly. So you get holes. It's not in the case with the Starchild. It's not progeria. And here, looking at the section of the skull and the shape of the eye sockets, which represents the Starchild skull more. You know, again, if you look at the eye sockets on this from a progeria victim, and this is the normal human, the Starchild's actual shape of the eye sockets, not the depth, is much more similar to a human than a progeria victim. Okay, so you're going to go away from here and put into your favourite search engine Starchild skull, and you're probably going to come up with 2 or 3 pages at the top of the list. You might get the Starchild Project website, it depends, but you're going to come up with Wikipedia, or I've got a ruder name for it, but I won't say that here. I'll see if this clip will play. I've got it in the media player, so I might have to flick. I've got Lloyd Pye talked about Wikipedia in his presentations because he became very aware of this, and they put out false information not only about the Starchild, which is still there, and Lloyd Pye as well. See if this will play here.
But it's like Wikipedia, for example. You go read about me on Wikipedia or read about the Starchild on Wikipedia, and you think, I just listened to just a jerk, a complete jerk tonight, right? Yeah. Okay, so here's what happened with Wikipedia. When people said, do you know what they say about you on Wikipedia? I said, well, no, not really. I hadn't even looked at it. I didn't even know I was on Wikipedia. It was really a surprise. This was several years ago. And I read it and I said, God, where did they come up with this garbage, you know? And so I said, I'm gonna fix this. And so I started trying to fix it. Every time I would try to fix it, a day or two later, it would be fixed back the way it was. What was that about? So I started calling to see, you know, who can I talk to? I got to get this fixed. This is wrong. Ultimately, I worked my way up to the head honcho of the states with Wikipedia. He was a guy in Florida. And it turns out that most of Wikipedia is written and maintained by graduate students in colleges around the world. Graduate students who have nothing better to do, who don't have enough work to do, that's what they do. And when they put, and they watch out for alternative knowledge people. Anything to do with alternative knowledge, they're going to slag it. They're going to trash it. They're going to put it up and slag it as hard as they can. And then they put monitors on it so that if anybody tries to change anything, they have tip-offs in their computers and they fix it back the way it was. Okay? So I got the head honcho and I said, look, everything in, I mean, some of it's right, but most of it's wrong. Just not just wrong, but bad wrong, egregiously wrong. and I'd like you to get it fixed and get it closer to right. And he said, Mr. Pi, you are the last person on earth that I would expect to tell the truth about yourself. I'm the last person on earth to really know the truth about myself. When I was born, all this sort of stuff. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but that is their attitude. You can't. A guy tried to do that and didn't do it, didn't get anything. But I'll tell you this, I told this last Saturday at London, and a guy said, I didn't believe that. And so I went in and started just making changes to see what would happen. He said, one change lasted 12 hours. One change lasted 18 hours. Another one lasted all the way up to 48 hours. But he says, I see what you mean. They will not let your material be changed. And it won't. It's not even worth trying. Now, another thing I can tell you about the criticism of the Starchild that you'll read about on the internet is this. There's plenty of it, but it's all built around one article by one man, written in late 1999. Remember when I told you that the DNA came in from the Canada lab and it was negative and that was it? Okay. A guy, like a professional skeptic, a guy who really works hard for the skeptics, wrote an article about it, and that article became like gospel to all the critics and all the skeptics. Stephen Novella is his name. Stephen Novella, if you want to look it up. Okay, Stephen Novella. Yeah, I'm going to lose my voice here pretty soon screaming like this. Novella wrote this article, put it out there in 1999, and it became the reference, and to this day, I don't know that another skeptic, serious skeptic, or Skeptic Magazine has ever tackled the Starchild. I know that Skeptic Magazine has not. I know that the Skeptical Inquirer has not, and those are the big two. Why not? Because they know we're doing good work here. They let the Novella article stand and they reference it every time because he wrote it in 1999 when I had made a lot of mistakes and I didn't know very much. And when the DNA came in negative, so that's what they use as if that's a fact. So I let it go, and in 2003, when the DNA evidence came in, there was another big push for it, and the critics got stirred up, and then it went away. Then in 2006, when the DNA test was announced, the 454 test was announced, and I started announcing on my website, okay, we're going to win this. This is it. This is what we've been waiting for 3 years for. This is it. Home run city coming our way. Then they really cranked up. And so it got so bad that I contacted Novella. I wrote him an email and I said, look, I understand how this game is played. You're in this to win. You're in this for my blood. You're in this to make me look as bad as you can. I understand. But let's play a little bit fair. Could we? Here's what your article says that's completely wrong, and here's what the truth of it is. Could you at least put some balance? Could you say, this is what I think, this is what he says? Just do anything to fix it up so that it's a little more balanced and a little more fair. Could you do anything? And he sent me back this one-line reply. The article stands as written. The article stands as written. But he did make one change, one critical, crucial change. Instead of looking at a copyright date of 1999 on that article, you will find a copyright date of 2006. He bumped it up to then, as if in 2006 that was the truth. This is how they play. It's hardball, folks. It is hardball. They take no prisoners. They have to win. See, the difference is I can live with losing this. I can go back to my life as a hominoid and human origins researcher. My life doesn't depend on this. Their life depends on maintaining the status quo because everything changes for them. They are hanging off a cliff by their fingernails. I'm just poor. It's a different feeling. You know what I'm saying?
So that was Lloyd explaining about the Wikipedia and skeptics information. And it's actually, since he did that talk back in 2009, that was a talk that I organised for him in Nottingham. Things have got worse, actually. I'm going to come to that. I just wanted to go back to the earlier clip. It should have all been in. This has been slightly out of order to what the order it should have been in, but it's not too bad. We remember this David Aguilar clip. Now it's coming up, of course. He wouldn't do this before. Yeah, what you saw at the end of this clip that I played a few minutes ago, sorry to be jumping around a little bit, but I think I can make my point clear enough, is that this David Aguilar guy, who's this, guy who pontificates about alien life at Harvard University, He said, I'd love to bring one of these guys into a real lab and have everybody take a look at it. That's what he actually says in that clip that I played when he's in front of the whiteboard, sounding off about how the DNA would be all different and they'd have a different evolutionary environment and so forth. And then Bill Burns says, oh, this might be an alien hybrid skull. He says, prove it. Aguilar doesn't say, oh, can I borrow this skull? Can I take it in my lab to have a look at it? And what he's actually saying is, I don't actually want to take this into a lab because I would be finished and I wouldn't be able to do my speculative fun and get paid for it. That's what he's saying. And that's the way the academic community really works. So we're going to have a race through the DNA now. There's going to be quite a lot of information. I'm not an expert on DNA. I know bits and pieces, but I'm not an expert. The DNA tests basically show that this thing isn't human. It's not a human. It's not even close. So what is DNA? It's deoxyribonucleic acid. In a human, you have 46 chromosomes. If you unravel the DNA, it will extend to a length of 2 meters. It has these base pairs, which I'll show you on the next slide. 3 billion of them. And there's approximately 30,000 genes which code for proteins that perform most functions of life. So you've got 30,000 genes and 3 billion base pairs. What is a base pair? Well, it's made up of two proteins. The proteins are called thymine, adenine, guanine, cytosine. It's like a 4-bit digital code of life, which of course was discovered in the 1950s. I was saying, in a human, there's 46 chromosomes, 30,000 genes each. And so in total, you've got 3 billion nucleotide bases arranged in pairs. That's what makes up a creature's DNA. Now, in humans and many other mammals, I think probably all other mammals, you've actually got 2 types of DNA. You've got what's called mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and you've got nuclear DNA, nuDNA. The mitochondrial DNA comes down from the maternal side only, and the nuclear DNA is from both parents. So what you can do is you can do a study of mitochondrial DNA, and you can trace your gene line back through history through your mother's line. In the mitochondrial DNA, it has 16,569 base pairs. And red blood cells are different. They have a different set of DNA in them. But each cell, human cell, has nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA apart from blood cells. So what you do is with DNA testing, when you do it, you use what are called primers. They're like bits of a jigsaw where you kind of like, if you imagine that the DNA is broken into pieces and you're trying to find out which pieces you want to look at and examine, it's like you throw these jigsaw pieces into your mix and they attach to these proteins in the DNA and then you pull them both out. Hopefully you've got a match. And so the primers are bits of proteins that are put in a match, and then you do this amplification technique, and the primers are basically 20 to 30 base pairs long, so you get these little chunks of DNA, and they're different sort of weights and so forth, and you can do this technique called electrophoresis, and you can put them into a chart, essentially, and see what base pairs you've got, and you can compare these with known DNA tests to find out what base pairs are actually there. Now, what happened in 1999 that Lloyd Pye referred to in the clip where he was talking in front of the group there, about Wikipedia, he referred to the first test that was done at the Bold Labs at the University of British Columbia in 1999. And they basically used an ordinary forensics lab, and they declared that they'd found the skull of a human male child. But they stated that in the recovery, they'd only recovered 200 picograms of DNA, and that's 10 to the minus 12 grams. And actually, they would normally need 5 times that amount to give a reliable conclusion. And they declared it was a human child, male, and that was it as far as Lloyd Pye was concerned then. Everyone said, forget about the Starchild, all these deformities don't matter, it's a human child, go back home. Lloyd Pye said, put it in the blender. Then in 2003, Lloyd was still sort of working in the background, he still had the website going, he still had all the deformities that I've gone through in this talk and others which I haven't. And he basically was informed that there was a new company starting up which had done tests on the Kennewick man, which was quite well known in the US. Ancient DNA, they were working with DNA that was up to 5,000 years old. And they came forward and they were approached as well and agreed to do the tests. And they did new tests in 2003 with more advanced testing techniques which had been developed. And they found, as it was said in the clip, the first clip that I played, which was where they found human mitochondrial DNA in the female side, and they couldn't recover the Starchild's nuclear DNA. Now, it turned out a bit later, as you'll see, that the mitochondrial DNA was similar to human, but it wasn't human. We'll see that in a minute or two. So the DNA results in 2003 indicated probably that the mother was a human female and the father was non-human. So it was said, and it's still said, you'll still find this on the internet today, the more positive Starchild supporting sites will say, oh yeah, it's a human hybrid. It's an alien-human hybrid. Not true, not true. Because later tests were done starting in 2010. Yeah. So 2003, hybrid, alien hybrid. And that Lloyd was going around saying that for about 7 years in his various talks. But then new recovery techniques were developed in 2006, these life sciences, which Lloyd had mentioned in the clip, which was filmed in 2009. And they didn't use primers, so they weren't using this jigsaw method. I think they were using like a weighing method or something. I don't quite know how this works because I'm not a geneticist. But this new technique had come online. It was still very expensive. To sequence a whole organism's DNA would have cost over $1 million at the time. But then another chap, I think he was using a similar technique called shotgunning. He approached Lloyd Pye in 2010 and he basically had got the approval of his company, which is a US-based company. They do gene research. We don't know, still don't know, I don't know who the company is, but I know the name of the geneticist. I know his first name at least. And he approached Lloyd and says, oh yeah, I can do some tests for you, but my company doesn't want anything, their name attached to it. They've let me use the lab. They're happy for me to use the lab, but it's going to be kept secret. We're not going to say publicly that we're doing it, but we will do it and we'll give you the results. And this guy got involved and he started recovering nuclear DNA, which was the real key to finding out much more about what the Starchild actually was. And in March 2010, he had recovered quite a few fragments of nuclear DNA, the first time ever this had been done. And so they knew it was there, they knew that they could analyze it and sequence it and so forth, and this guy was doing it. So what did he get? So he got this chart. What do you do with it? You get all these sort of readings coming out, these base pairs that are all numbers and so forth. You essentially get a numbered code coming out with this ADTC sort of code coming out, etc. ADTG. And you put it into a database, and this is what they did. The National Institutes of Health have this database of DNA. It's a big US site. Anybody that does DNA research can buy a subscription to this, and that DNA database is built from subscription money. It's paid for with that. It's held in the National Institutes of Health at Washington, D.C. You buy an account, buy a subscription. You can go on, put in your DNA sequences, which you've developed from your test, and you can see which sequences come out. And so we had, for example, the geneticist had recovered 265 base pairs in one of the runs that he did, and he put this into the NIH database, and it made a match with a human nuclear DNA, 265 base pairs long. And this work continued over, it was at least 2 years, I think maybe even as long as 4 or 5 years this went on. But then he put another sequence of 342 base pairs, which is a longer sequence, obviously, and it did not match any human. But not only did it not match any human, it didn't match anything in the database at all. Because some of you may be aware that some of our DNA matches with millipedes. You have some DNA sequences in common with millipedes or dogs or whatever, or dolphins and so forth. We do have, but this didn't match anything. So this was getting to be very unusual. And they did a spectrophotometer reading, which measures the purity of the DNA, and that would give you a particular shape for human DNA as a particular characteristic. And this chart was, again, different for human, between human and Starchild. So that was another indication that this DNA wasn't human. Mitochondrial DNA, again, only comes down the female line. This was retested. And Mitochondrial DNA is very highly conserved because there's much less of it. There are fewer differences between generations. And they found that the mitochondrial DNA, when they actually retested this in 2010, there were many more mutations. So they actually found that although superficially it looks similar to human, when they looked at the detail, it's a lot different. There's far too much variation in the Starchild's mitochondrial DNA for it to be human. That was the end result. About 700% different by probability projections to humans. And the big thing here, I'm going to mention this again briefly, they discovered a particular gene called the FOXP2 gene, or BOXP2 gene. And this is like a master gene, and this dictates the way that other genes form during growth and development. And the FOXP2 gene has 2,594 base pairs, so it's made up of a sequence of that. It's one of the most highly conserved genes in our bodies, and you're only allowed, the whole of the human species all across the planet, your FOXP2 genes are identical, except you can have two genes which are different. And if you have either of those genes different, one means you have no speech, and the other means that you die. And so they found in this chap, he was definitely able to identify it as the FOXP2 gene, the Starchild's equivalent, but it had 700 variations rather than 2. So again, totally different to human. Totally different. And these are the charts and sequences that were sent to Lloyd Pye. Obviously a bit meaningless to us because we're not geneticists. But this is to show you that the evidence was produced. It was given to Lloyd and he put it in his presentations. And I've got a DVD at the back there of Lloyd going through all of this as well from the lecture that he did in Derby in 2012. That's also online as well, so you don't have to buy the DVD. So this chart here shows you, I don't know how well you can see this, it's a little bit small, I should have put this full screen really, that the Starchild is this much different to human. I think a monkey is this much different. I think that's a mouse, that's that much different. 20 differences in the FOXP2, 27 in a dog, 21 in an elephant, 21 in, I think that's a lemur, 26, I don't know what that animal is, I can't see it very well, 56 in the Starchild. So it's way different, much, much different. The probability that such a highly specific arrangement of changes in a small fragment could have occurred by accumulation of sequencing errors is extremely low. This is what the geneticist said, if not close to 0. Nor could this arrangement have occurred due to contamination with the DNA of any known species. From this evidence, one may conclude that the underlying biochemistry of the entity's life form must be either the same as or highly similar to humans or other species. Yet, the use of the genetic code, which still remains universal, is distinctively different, implying that this life form is very likely the result of a markedly variant and non-intersecting evolutionary process. Okay, thank you, Ben. So, not from round here, folks. It's not from round here. And despite what you read, these experts, 10 of them are named. These are on the Starchild Project website. They've all put their names. They say, we've never seen anything like this. As far as we're concerned, it doesn't match any other human that we know of. They don't outright say, yes, it's an alien skull. But, you know, you're then faced with, if it's not human, it's not a monkey, it's not, from a large mammal, what is it from? They basically all share that same position. They're all named. Okay. I'll just play a little. I think I've got a facial. Yeah. People ask about facial reconstructions. The guy that made this, he had to take human eyeballs and cut them in half. They weren't real human eyeballs, obviously made out of some resin type of material or something. To fit them in these mock-up, he had to cut them in half. So that's just a little animation of that. This guy was abducted by aliens, and he got a sculpture made. This was a lawyer that Lloyd got in touch with, and he had a sculpture made by somebody to, tweaked it so it made it look like the aliens. Again, this is similar to what the Starchild may have looked like. And this was a mock-up done by Rob Roy Menzies. And this was there was a big thing. People would say, was it like the front of the Communion book by Whitley Strieber? But no, it wasn't like that. That's a different facial shape, different eye shape. But that's a comparison that Lloyd put together for one of his talks. On the left, the Amico alien. That seems to be more in line with the shape of the... I won't go into the story of the Amico alien. I haven't got time. Okay. Yeah, just to note that there's apparently Lloyd became Weird Skull Central. Other weird skulls were sent to him, or pictures of, and we had this one that came out in Peru, which I'm going to talk about very briefly. But Lloyd always said that the Paracas skulls, you can look at these, there's videos about these. These have got a 3,000 cc cranial capacity. This is not head binding. With head binding, you can only change the shape of the skull. You can't substantially increase the volume of the skull. Same with the Paracas skulls, and there's another picture. So Lloyd said that they should be DNA tested, like the Starchild. And this, again, is this more recent one, the Peru skull. Brian Foster has pushed this. He's made a video about it. But you can see here, just from this bone cracking here, this is almost certainly hydrocephalic. It's also lopsided. This is bulged here more than this here. This is a young hydrocephalic. You can see it's much smaller. Fits in the palm of the hand. I think I've got another picture. Yeah, it's very much smaller. That's just a hydrocephalic skull. It's not Starchild. Brian Foster has tried to say it's another Starchild skull. It's not. It's almost certainly a hydrocephalic infant. And there's another one. And some more shots of that. That's all analysed on the Starchild Project website. Okay, so now we get onto the research status. Research history and recent history and status of the research. No new information has been posted since about 2012. Matthew Brownstein, who took over kind of after Lloyd Pye died to some extent, he became a partner in the Starchild Project in 2013, along with Amy Vickers, who was Lloyd's ex-wife. She has curated the Starchild Project website. A crowdfunding campaign was launched in 2013, and it was through that that replica skulls were created. People could buy replica skulls and contribute to the research. Lloyd Pye sadly died in December 2013, which was a huge loss to everyone that knew him and the research community. Melanie Young started doing talks. She's the Starchild skull owner, but there's been some very troubling developments in the last 9 months, which I'll mention in a minute. People in the disclosure movement are not that interested in the Starchild skull. That's why I'm talking about it, because not many people talk about it, and they should be talking about it. What's happened is Melanie Young has now said the StarchildProject.com, she's no longer associated with that. The website is still running, but they've now broken off, being directly involved with it. And she's teamed up with this woman called Chase Kloetsky. This is Melanie Young. And I've written an article about this. Okay, so what's happened recently? I thought I had a slide of this, but I must have forgotten to put it. I was sure I'd put it in this presentation. But Melanie Young has now become a debunker. She has now said, she's backtracked. I'll just play a clip of her from, this is what she said recently.
I'm not ruling out hydrocephaly anymore. I was at the beginning because I bought into Lloyd, but I'm not going to rule that out. Now that I've looked at it, and I think what people do, and I'm one of those. As where I worked, I saw the freak hydrocephalics. Okay, the ones with the big ballooned heads.
Yep.
But, and you go to Google and you Google hydrocephalics, you see the freaks at the top. But go down 2 pages, and then you're going to see children that are hydrocephalic. They look like this. Okay? I can point out pictures, and I think I've got them on my website now, where this picture could explain this defect.
If it were a hydrocephalic, this would be bulged out, okay? But only one side would be bulged out, or the back would be bulged. It wouldn't be symmetrical like that is.
So a hydrocephalic skull is asymmetrical.
It's asymmetrical.
And this skull is symmetrical.
It's completely symmetrical. If that were a hydrocephalic, the bones would not be connected. There would be no skull.
What other explanation do you have for this skull?
I don't have one.
So you heard right there that she no longer believes that the skull is from a hydrocephalic. So what's been the change? And she is now going round and saying that this is the skull of a human child. But what you've seen here is all the physical differences show that this thing isn't human. The teeth are different to a human. The internal structure of the X-ray shows it's different from human. The brain cast shows it's different from human. The bone chemistry is different from human. The mitochondrial DNA tests and the nuclear DNA tests both show that it's very different from humans. Yet what's happened now is that Melania Young is saying it's the skull of a human child. And this woman she's now teamed up with is basically saying that Lloyd Pye was putting out false information. So if that's true, why did Melanie Young stay with Lloyd Pye and actually do a repeat of his talk for 14 years? Why has she suddenly said it's now a human when she actually gave it to Lloyd Pye initially to get him to investigate it? And I've got a whole article on my website about this. In fact, this is the slide here I was trying to get to. I think I've covered all of that. They've basically now thrown it away. She's thrown away 15, 16, 17, 18 years of research. She's thrown it away, and that all happened early this year. And this fellow, Mel Fabregas, he was involved. They both essentially said that Lloyd Pye lied, he made stuff up, and he was putting out wrong information. But it's this woman that's lied, and I've got an article about that on my website, that she's lied about both Lloyd Pye and about the nature of some of these scientific texts. So it's a very sad end, or apparent end. If you want to get more of Lloyd Pye's information, there's a book that's come out on Amazon, Everything You Know is Still Wrong. That's recently come out. That's available now. And that's basically it from me. I've got books and DVDs at the back, so you can come and talk to me about those if you're interested. And obviously we might do a Q&A later and whatnot. So thanks very much for listening, everybody, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you.